So, Fred, social theory has become something of an impoverished concept, generally meaning some kind of empirical theory or mid-range theory. But you have a different background in social theory. So I'm wondering what you see as the place of social theory within sociology.
Well, when you think about it, when you think about theory, there is indeed an underlying assumption, certainly I would say in the United States and also in France to a certain extent, that theory only serves somehow to frame your data. Of course, when you look at theory, you have different conceptions of theory. And in my understanding, I always make a distinction, work with a triple distinction between metatheory, social theory, and sociological theory, which has just to do with, with the levels of abstraction and also, in fact, the approximation to philosophy. So if we start with metatheory, I mean, that would be really kind of at the level of looking at the philosophical presuppositions of let's say, the social theories, which could be in anthropology and sociology and the other of the neighboring sciences. And definitely I think that is actually where critical realism comes in. I think it's very, very strong on the meta-theoretical front. The second concept, social theory, was actually one that was usefully introduced by Giddens in the 1980s. And basically, it's not looking at philosophical issues, but it's looking at the central concepts and the central problems within the social sciences. So at the time in the 1980s, that's basically when, the whole issue of agency and structure and how you can link them came on the agenda. But since then, I think, and especially thanks to the influx of French theory and the studies, what we can see is that there the questions have shifted. I think the issue of realism, constructivism, the questions of identity, the questions of power, that's where they come in. And then when you go to the third concept, when you look at sociological theory, which would basically be kind of a reflection on, let's say, the different stages of modernity and the tendencies within modernity. And that is where sociology emerged, as a reflection on modernity. But then, of course, what we know with late modernity and so on. And I think definitely in the last years, in the last decade, I mean, we all have this feeling that, modernity has come to its end. As a matter of fact, I even call it like late post-modernity or the second post-modernity. So I would say when you think about theory, and in fact it's the whole package, and if you can put them all together, I mean, then you're basically doing grand theory. But nowadays, nobody is still doing that. I would say, perhaps with the exception of Habermas, to a certain extent, Bourdieu. But I think the time of great and grand theories is kind of over. And I think that precisely by going back to meta-theoretical issues at the interface between the social sciences and philosophy, actually critical realism is really doing the groundwork precisely to take up the job again and to think, in fact, not just about meta-theory, but also about social theory, its central concepts, and precisely with the intention to do something like an ontology of the present and for the present.
You've mentioned Bourdieu. Now, I believe in the past you suggested that Bourdieu is the preeminent social theorist of our times. Yeah. There's a lot of controversy about Bourdieu, about how to understand him, particularly his central concepts around field, habitus. Now, I know that within critical realism you've advocated for Bourdieu. How do you see Bourdieu as addressing these questions?
Well, that's, of course, how would I say? Bourdieu, I think, is really the hegemon in the field. And if I say that, it is because I'm thinking that he occupies the same position within the field of global social theory that Parsons occupied in the 1950s, in fact, 1940s, 1950s. And this is important because what we can see is that within sociology, we basically have lost our narrative, in the sense that if you would look at the syllabuses on sociological theory, in the United States, elsewhere, the standard narrative is basically the narrative that comes from Giddens and that comes from especially Jeffrey Alexander, which is, you had Parsons who basically presented the first synthesis of the classics, and then you had a challenge from the micro-sociological front, and then also from the leftist front, and then you had the new synthesis. And the new synthesis is basically Habermas, Giddens, Bourdieu, and so on. But what we can see, in fact, is that since then, which was a story of the 1980s, 1990s, we don't have a story anymore. And I think that by putting Bourdieu on the agenda as the hegemon, I mean, you can actually reorganize not only the French field of social theory, but I think even the global field of theory, and capture not only, let's say, I'm thinking about Boltanski, Latour for France, perhaps Caillé as well, but just think about the UK. I mean, just think about critical realism and Margaret Archer. It allows you, in fact, to reorganize, the materials. When you look at the US, you could actually do exactly the same. You could look at the work of Jeffrey Alexander. You could even bring in Judith Butler and her debate with Bourdieu. Germany is also a very interesting case because when you look at the development of Axel Honneth's work, you can see that in the 1980s he was actually reading Bourdieu, and his insistence on recognition is basically a reaction to Habermas, and it is really about class issues where you see that working class people, if they protest or if they criticize, they don't do it verbally, but basically on the basis of non-recognition and diffuse feelings of suffering. So what I think, Bourdieu, when I characterize him as the hegemon, it is precisely because it allows you to reconstruct the recent history, but also because you can simply not ignore Bourdieu. You can like him or you can dislike him, but you can no longer ignore him. And I think the interface is really, really important. Moreover, when I say, critical realism should try to reclaim Bourdieu, I said that because what you have with Bourdieu, it's actually the only unifying factor we have in the field of sociology, because otherwise the field is completely scattered. It has become professionalized. And actually, thanks to Bourdieu, we still have a common language. Field habitus practices symbolical violence. Everybody, and that's not just that's not just in the West, but in India, for instance, I can see it as well. You can see that thanks to Bourdieu, we have a common language, and actually, you can also even talk to your colleagues in anthropology. So that is very important. Of course, when I say Bourdieu is really critical realist, I'm not ignoring the differences in terms of the epistemological background and the positions. When you look at it, what is interesting with Bourdieu, and I'm thinking especially of his book Le métier du sociologue, the craft of sociology, which is really an epistemological treatise. And when you look at the Anglo-Saxon tradition, they're always focusing, in fact, on Middle European thinkers, which is, the Vienna Circle, Popper, Kuhn, Lakatos, and so on. Bourdieu is actually coming from another tradition. He's mixing the neo-Kantian tradition of erkenntnis theory, where you can see very, very strong influence of Cassirer on his work, and he's also coming in from the tradition of historical epistemology, which is Bachelard, Canguilhem, and so on. So by looking at Bourdieu's work epistemologically, you can see he's not really a critical realist. He's a rationalist. But that is at the highest level of abstraction when you look at his epistemology. Once you go down to his social theory, what you can see then, that the notions of field and the notions of habitus, they are absolutely realistic. The only correction you have to make, and it's a realist correction, that it is by saying that it's not the models that kind of are analogous to reality, but you start with reality, and basically you don't say that it is the point of view that creates the object. But once you leave aside this kind of precaution, or better, you basically invert the epistemic vector that goes from reality to theory rather than from theory to reality, then I think with Bourdieu we are really in the field of critical realism. Because what does Bourdieu actually do? When you look at his concept of the field, as a system of of relations between social positions, that is exactly the same as what I think Bhaskara calls a structure. He has actually exactly the same definition. And I think that critical realism, to the extent that it is important, it is in the field of social theory, it is because of its very, very, very strong notion of structure. And I think that is important. Structure as a generative system of relation between positions is something which, conditions or determines, or whatever you want to call it, the habitus, which is actually a system of dispositions on the subjective level. And of course, when you think about it, you already have the notion of structure of critical realism. You have the notion of habitus as system of dispositions. And of course, when you think about it, Bhaskara was always talking about dispositions and tendencies. So I think, in fact, by thinking them together, you can actually make it stronger. And of course, what they are thinking about, both of them coming from, from the Marxist tradition, is precisely thinking, the capitalist system. Moreover, what is also very important is that both the field and the habitus, they are generative systems. They are invisible as such, but they can be observed in their effects. So, there, clearly, by using critical realism, we can actually make a lot of sense of Bourdieu's work, and actually, I think by forcing kind of the interchange, we really can move forward. And I think that yes, Bourdieu is our best example of critical realism. I know that within the circle of critical realists, there is a little bit of I think we have actually a very strong consensus with one exception, which is Margaret Archer, who worked with Bourdieu in the 70s. And then as time went by, she basically started to, for whatever reason, but become more antagonistic to Bourdieu. And the usual critique she makes is basically by somehow equating Bourdieu with Giddens, basically saying that both of them are conflating agency and structure, and therefore that they are guilty of central conflation. I think that is definitely true for the habitus, in the sense that the habitus and the practices, they are kind of intermingled, but it is not true for the notion of the field. I think that with the notion of the field, and when you look at the notion of the field and connect it to the habitus, we are not talking about duality. We are clearly talking about the dualism. Also because Bourdieu makes it quite clear that you have actually to start with the construction of the object, which is basically constructing the object, which means putting it into the field. So clearly it draws very, very strong neo-objectivist tendencies in Bourdieu. So I think that her critique of Bourdieu, I think it definitely holds for the habitus, but it doesn't hold, in fact, for the notion of the field. So I think that there, instead of being kind of oppositional, I would basically suggest that working together, or let's say reading together Bhaskara and Bourdieu, and I would also say Archer, that actually there we can work in the direction of a strong, integrative, synthetic social theory. When we think about Bourdieu's position on the development within modernity, I don't think that is his strongest point, in the sense that being not trained as an anthropologist, but having become an anthropologist because he was trained as a philosopher. But I think the anthropological part is very strong in his work, with the result indeed that it works better for traditional societies, even if what distinguishes, if you want, modernity is precisely the emergence of fields. If you want to make the analogy with functionalism or systems theory, you would say the emergence of subsystems. But on the other hand, it doesn't go very far in kind of updating and updating this how would I say, this whole theory and bringing it to the present. And I think his critical interventions in the public sphere, basically against neoliberalism and the critique of capitalism, basically is an attempt to actualize, but it's also above all an attempt to politicize. And I think that on this point, I'm not sure that Bourdieu is very good. And I would even go further. I'm not even sure that critical realism is very good, precisely to the extent that its political stances and its political stance almost overdetermines anything which they have to say about the ontology of the present. And I think that there probably we need a more differentiated approach to really think about the present. McGearty, on the other hand, with her more recent reflections on the reflexivity and morphogenesis, is going in that direction. But then I think the problem is a general one within sociology and within sociological theory. Basically, I think that since 2008, we have a lot of difficulty to understand and to accompany the present, just because it poses some radical challenges, and just falling back on some kind of Marxism, basically to position yourself, is not very helpful. So my position is that instead of trying basically to position yourself, it's much better to say, well, we don't understand what is going on, and certainly as sociologists we don't have any privileges. And I would even say that sociology as a discipline of the 20th century probably is missing the coach, in the sense that it's not very good to capture the rapid transformations of the present. And it's not very good for the simple reason that it, for disciplinary reasons, always wants to go back to the 19th century, basically to its founders, Marx, Weber and Durkheim. Whereas when you think, in fact, about the ontology of the present, you see that the studies, basically this whole conglomerate of reflections that is influenced by French theory, especially Foucault, Deleuze, Derrida, they are thinking the social, but they don't have the ballast of having to go back to the classics. So when you think about, I don't know, Negri and Hart or Judith Butler or others, you can see that they have their finger on the pulse, they are thinking the present, but they don't have the ballast of having to prove at any moment that they are sociologists. And I think they are actually better than I would say than we are.
So this takes me to my next question, which is the place of critical theory in social theory today. Now, you have a background in critical theory, looking at questions of alienation and reification. We've mentioned Habermas and Honneth.
Yeah.
What do you see the place of critical theory today within sociology?
Well, critical theory, it depends on how you conceive of it. If you think of critical theory as basically, how would I say, if you have what I would call a municipal conception of critical theory as having to loop it back to the Frankfurt School, well, then yes, its position is quite clear. Going back, in fact, I think to the 1920s, which is an attempt to basically rethink Marxism by injecting a very good doses of Hegel, the standard figure there. And I think you cannot understand anything of what I call the municipal conception of critical theory without going back to Lukács, who is, of course, the main figure. And I think, yes, that the whole theme and the whole problematic of alienation and reification is absolutely central. Of course, there are ruptures. What you can see with the first generation, I think that reification was kind of inbuilt into its theories, in the sense that by bringing in, by a true fusion of Marx's theory of alienation with Weber's theory of formal domination, formal rationalization, they basically ended up painting, the Iron Cage in black. The second generation, I think, with Habermas, there is continuity, but there is also quite a lot of discontinuity. And I think the discontinuity is in fact more important than the continuity. I think, yes, thematically you have continuity, it's the same problematic. thinking about domination, alienation, and reification, but what you can see is that the structure of feeling is completely different. I mean, rather than thinking that we are damned anyway, so therefore the task is to paint black on grey, I think the different sensibilities precisely presupposing that the situation is indeed quite dramatic, and to this, if we are thinking about today, sometimes it feels as if the first generation of critical theory, Adorno, Marcuse, Horkheimer, that they were basically anticipating what was to come. But I think that this idea of presupposing precisely the conjunction of capitalism and industrialism as kind of a system of oppression and domination, the point is precisely to try to think, in fact, how we can get out of the mess. When you think about the third generation, when you think about Axel Honneth, I think his work is quite important, but his theory of recognition was, of course, initially not meant as an alternative to Habermas. It is only later that it became like that. So when I think about it, I really think that what we need is a communicative theory of recognition, because Habermas's framework is much more solid and encompassing than Honneth. And once you do that, then of course you can actually work your way forward. So, linking that back to critical realism, what is obvious is that there is there also quite a lot of space for interchange, in the sense that they all come out of a Hegelian Marxist tradition, with this difference that that I think, in fact, that in spite of his dialectical mode of thinking, that Bhaskar really stands in the analytical tradition. It's an analytical way of thinking about dialectics. But in fact, I think they when you bring them together, I think instead of opposing them, you can actually move forward. Because my vision has always been that when it comes to, let's say, the foundational issues of social theory, that critical realism is probably the best option we have to tackle ontological and epistemological questions. No doubt about that. I mean, we have a solid epistemology, even if, of course, a critical realist don't like the term of epistemology and want to reformulate that as ontology. But when it comes to the normative issues, basically the questions of the normative foundations of critique, then I must say that I definitely think that Habermas is actually, and I would even say the same for Honneth, that they are probably better than critical realism, than Bhaskar. But there again, the point is not just to oppose them, but basically by bringing in, for instance, ontological and epistemological questions into the work of Habermas and Honneth, you can actually point to some shortcomings, and you can actually also overcome them, because Habermas clearly stands in a neo-Kantian tradition, and he has some problems to think the ontological element. But on the other hand, I think if you look at the normative issues and you look at critical realism with Habermasian eyes, you can also make it quite stronger, especially on the point of rational judgment, which is, of course, a crucial element, but also it allows you to bring in other traditions, which I think critical realism has left aside. And here I'm especially thinking about hermeneutics and phenomenology, whereas critical realism really stands in this Anglo-Saxon tradition, and I think to go back to the discussion about Bourdieu and critical realism, we have a very solid conception of structure, field, system, but I think when it comes to culture and its relation to agency or to a theory of action, I think that there actually the German tradition is better. So I think that given that they all come from the same tradition, precisely the Marxist tradition, with a very strong Hegelian influx, I think that we have to think them together rather than in opposition. So to go back to your question then about critical theory, I was only pointing to one strand, which is precisely the Marxist strand, but where you go back to Hegel and by bringing in a good deal of Weber as well. But I think now that there is another strand in critical theory, broadly conceived, and that basically is not by going back to Hegel, unless it is to set them up as the enemy. Essentialism, historicism, the whole story. But in fact, what they do, I think they probably went back to Spinoza in order to reformulate Marxism, and there, of course, Althusser is extremely important. And interestingly, in the same way as the first strand kind of does a junction of Hegel, Marx, and Weber, the other strand, Althusser, what they do in fact is they go back to Spinoza, and it's not via Weber that they pass, but they pass via Durkheim. And in fact, this Durkheimian Marxism, this is exactly what structuralism is. And with Althusser, and especially if you start reading Althusser, you also get post-structuralism. And I'm thinking especially here of his later texts about the materialism of the encounter, where you can already see that the whole issue of post-structuralism is coming in. And if you define critical realism in this broad way, then you can catch actually all the post-Althusserians, and that goes from Laclau to people like Butler, Zizek, whomever it is. So I think if you think about critical theory in this more encompassing way, yes, then I think indeed that there we have some kind of an opposition between, on the one hand, I would say a more Hegelian strand in which Bosca would stand, and then the post-structuralist, even when you radicalize it, the post-humanist tradition, that is indeed where we have a whole field of sparring partners. And I think on this issue, for instance, a lot of dialogue and reconstruction is necessary, but it's not very easy. I'm just thinking, for instance, about what post-colonialism does to, let's say, our municipal conception of critical theory. It's something which is rather difficult, and on this point, I really think that critical theory in the Frankfurt tradition is not very well placed. Critical realism is doing a little bit better, but I think a lot of work has to be done. And again, a work of basically dialogue and probably mutual learning, and so I would say critical realism stands in this tradition, but I think a lot of dialogue and a lot of is necessary, precisely because if the point of critical theory is basically to reflexively accompany the developments of the present, I mean, then we are all standing, I would say, on the same side, and it's definitely necessary to collaborate a little bit more and to polemicize a little bit less.
So this takes me to my final question, and I suppose in many respects this is the opposite of the question about critical theory. I mean, we're here for a conference on values and human flourishing. Critical realism has a long-standing critique of the fact-value dichotomy.
Sure.
And in terms of this language of flourishing, how do you respond to that? How do you see a place of flourishing, or what's sometimes been called positive sociology, within social theory, or is this something that perhaps like the post-structuralists we should avoid and perhaps even spar with?
Well, first of all, about the fact-value distinction, I really think this distinction is extremely problematic. And this has been the doxa within the field, in the sense that value freedom is something which we have to strive for, which is basically, if you understand it as, we have to try to be objective, then of course there is nothing against it, because there must be somehow, somewhere, a distinction between science and ideology. But on the other hand, what appears as kind of a common sense position, when you link it back to Max Weber, Max Weber was definitely not a common sense figure. When you put him back into the tradition of moral philosophy, what you can see is that he takes a very, very radical position, in the sense that he is clearly a Nietzschean, and the basic presupposition underneath of value freedom is precisely, relativism, nihilism, and decisionism, which is not a consensual position. I actually think that the time has come now to revise this doxa and precisely to rethink it, because the debate about axiological neutrality was last time it really was on the table was in the 1960s and the 1970s. It was basically part of this ping-pong game between Marxism and Weberianism. But I really think that we have to revisit this issue, and I even think that within sociology that it shouldn't be too difficult to come to a new consensus, which is basically that the fact-value distinction doesn't work, and that sociology cannot be value-free, for the simple reason that there is facts seep into values, values seep into facts, but also because the Weberian position is not a consensual position. It's actually a very radical position, which just wipes out with one hand and crushes with a big hammer the whole tradition of moral philosophy. So when you look at the whole tradition and then you think about flourishing, I think that flourishing just represents one strand. I mean, as you know, and better than I do, it refers to Aristotelian positions. But I think the good life is only one aspect. And there I really like a phrase which comes from Paul Ricoeur, where he's basically reconstructing the whole spectrum of ethics. And he's saying, well, the ethics is defined by the visée of the good life with and for the others in just institutions. I think given the environmental collapse that we are facing, he probably should have added as well in a sustainable environment. But leaving that aside, when you look at virtue ethics, and then you have and which is usually opposed to, in just institution, to the whole question of justice, which goes back to Kant. And then in the middle you have with and for the others, which is basically the whole issue of sympathy, benevolence, which postmodern ethics has brought to the front. So I think it is a little bit risky of putting all your eggs into the basket of neo-Aristotelian ethics of virtue. Also because I think that the renaissance of virtue ethics is quite often also a restoration. I mean, the neo-Aristotelianism quite often comes up as a disguised form of neo-Thomism. And fine, I mean, it's a position which I kind of can respect, but when I look at the main representatives, especially within the Anglo-Saxon tradition, MacIntyre and Nussbaum, I must say that I'm not 100% convinced. Now, when you look at Bhaskar, then obviously he was thinking about eudaimonia. But when you think about the different phases in his work, I think that the insistence on the good life, if you're a good Bhaskarian, you're going to think it from the last phase, which is basically the philosophy of meta-reality. And that is really what I think he was, that would be one way of looking at it. The good life is basically about self-realization and the realization of the dialectic self. But then on the other hand, Bhaskar was also standing and coming from another tradition, which is basically a very strong insistence on justice. And that is where it links up to critical theory again. So when he was saying that the realization of each as a precondition of the realization of all. He was, of course, trying to build bridges from Aristotle basically to the Kantian tradition and to the Marxist tradition. So I just think that flourishing is absolutely fine, but I think to make it more combative, and in this sense to link it back to critical theory, there is no way you can make abstraction, in fact, of collective self-determination, the whole Kantian tradition. So I think there is a bit of a tussle there, and I'm not sure that critical realism should really put all its eggs on this one basket. Moreover, I also think that the basic problem with this return to Aristotle is not so much, as is often said, the problem of slavery and so on, but basically that we are living in modern, plural societies, and that we don't have any substantive consensus anymore on values. I think it's very difficult to come to a consensus on the common good. Perhaps, given the conjuncture, we can come to a consensus about the common bad. But I think that actually thinking about human flourishing at a collective level basically does no longer work. I think the risk of authoritarianism, the worst case, paternalism or maternalism is really there. And I think that in modern contemporary conditions, flourishing is basically something which only works at the individual level, in the sense that, of course, we all want to flourish, but I don't want to, and we can no longer impose our own vision, substantive vision of the good life on others, because that would be quite risky, precisely in terms of the risks of authoritarianism, paternalism, and maternalism. But of course, the good life on the personal level is something we really have to strive for. But when then we go back to Aristotle, going back to Aristotle in that respect is a little bit like going back to Buddha or to Jesus. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's absolutely important, but precisely that becomes on the level of personal conduct and our own striving for, I wouldn't call it happiness, because this has too strong utilitarian connotations, but precisely eudaimonia, flourishing. Yes, I mean, on an individual, on a personal level, it does make sense, but I'm not sure that on a collective level we can still think like the communitarians did, because that is too risky. As to your question about the positive psychology and positive sociology, well, it sounds very cheesy, positive psychology, but I think if we reformulate that more in terms like anti-negativism, then I think it is, yes, it points to something important, in the sense that I think critical theory, when we look at it, quite often it has kind of degenerated into some kind of hypercritique, which is basically good on denunciations, and then you can just build your own model. You can take, the Frankfurt School, a bit of Adorno, you take a little bit of Luhmann, you take a little bit of Foucault, you take a little bit of Deleuze, and basically you end up in a situation where the only thing you see is domination, repression, and symbolic violence. And I think it's very important also to move to the other side, not just going into the business of denunciation, but also actually to reinforcing what should be reinforced. Because precisely when things are very difficult at the structure level, probably you have to move the scale of analysis and actually look at local projects where things are actually going well. And I think the shift from critical sociology, what I would call a negativist sociology, to something like a positive or reconstructive sociology is absolutely essential. And together with my French friends from the convivialist movement, we have formulated a convivialist manifesto, which is precisely an attempt to look at all those beautiful initiatives from I don't know, slow science, slow food, Occupy or Pachamama, whatever it is, where basically they are actually already constructing another world underneath of the system, which I think is collapsing, whether you're thinking about global capitalism or on the one hand, or all the ecological problems of the Anthropocene. I think when you look actually at the lower level, at the community level, the interpersonal level, then I think you can see a lot of projects that have to be fostered, that have to be reinforced, and this is actually what we have to look at. I definitely wouldn't call it a positive sociology, because that sounds too cheesy. But the idea that we have to move from diagnosis to reconstruction, I think that is absolutely essential. I would even formulate it in terms which come from Spinoza. We have to theorize not just with the sad passions, anger, and kind of theorizing from the stomach up or down, but I think really that the point is also to think about the joyous passions, and I think that definitely that's what Roy in the last part of his life was thinking about. Love, creativity, compassion, all those kind of things are absolutely necessary. I think just to at least not to completely lose hope, and to look in fact at what is going on, and precisely what should be reinforced and what should be thought. So this move from negativism to positivism, or better to reconstruction, I very much approve of it.
Fred, I always love our discussions, so thank you for coming in and answering a few questions.